My name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the Research Director here at Chatham House for International Security. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Robert Malley, President and CEO of Crisis Group, who will be talking with us today on Crisis Group's 10 conflicts to watch in 2018, which is kind of now an annual sort of statement of the world and its problems that Crisis Group issues. And we're so pleased to be able to host this discussion in London again. This is being live streamed, and so it's on the record. I'd ask you please to turn your phones to silent, but get them out and tweet away, hashtag CH events, and I'm sure you wouldn't mind an @Crisis Group reference as well. So,
or even my name. Oh, fine.
That's at Rob Malley, yes? Yes. So we'll be employing this event to identify a number of key challenges ahead for global security and the potential for regional instability, and particularly looking at the foreign policy implications for governments around the world. Rob, you've served in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President, Senior Advisor to the President for the Counter-ISIL campaign, and White House Coordinator for the Middle East. You've also been Program Director for Middle East and North Africa at Crisis Group before you joined that, and you were then, before that, Special Assistant to President Clinton for Arab-Israeli affairs. So your credentials are impeccable when it comes to talking about all of these different crises, and you've got some real life experience. I mean, here you are in London. We've got a fantastic crowd here, and I know you remarked on that coming in, so I don't know.
When people think that, you know, the Western world is looking inwards, to get a crowd like this in the US on a foreign policy issue, there'd have to be some scandal associated with it. So I am quite amazed by how many people show, and thank you for doing that, and thanks for having me.
Maybe there's just something you don't know yet.
Maybe.
So perhaps you could just say a few words about why Crisis Group does this every year, and what impact you think outlining these top 10 crises has on focusing the mind in foreign relations.
So first of all, I mean, I assume most people here know a little bit about Crisis Group and why we feel like we have some ability to distinguish among the so many conflicts, the tens and tens of conflicts around the world, the 10, and I have to tell you, it's a battle among our analysts. You know, everyone wants their conflict among the top 10, although it shouldn't really be an honor, but they all feel like their conflict is one that should get more attention. We have analysts on the ground, and they're the ones who we listen to. So Crisis Group, I mean, we ask them from each program, give us your top 2, and then we try to work out, because they always give us more than 2, what are the top 10? And it's not necessarily the bloodiest conflicts or the ones that that garner most international attention. It's a combination of which are the most dangerous, which are the ones that may actually lack international attention and we want to bring it to their attention, but also which are the ones where there might be an opportunity for resolution and where our recommendations, we hope, will be listened to. You ask about our impact. That's something that we struggle with all the time, because the context today is not particularly conducive to people like us, telling governments, pay attention not just to what's happening within your borders, not just to the conflicts that you think are having an immediate impact, like those that have to do with terrorism or with migration, but other conflicts, obviously they have a human toll, and we think that matters immensely. But beyond that, the stability of the world, what's going to happen to there over time, to the equilibrium and to the balance of power, that all those issues, again, for us, it's our target and our constituency are the civilians who are victims of conflict. This may not be the time when governments care about that as much as we would like them to, but we keep knocking at their door. We keep trying to mobilize public opinion, like people in this room, and telling them conflict matters, and any conflict that is man or woman made can be resolved by the work of men and women.
So there's probably a fight for the order in which you list them. And you've got at the top this year the issue of North Korea. We've got the Winter Olympics about to begin. We've got the joint ice hockey team. Is this an opportunity? Can you see a way in which this situation, North Korea, can be resolved without conflict?
So the answer is yes. And first, you know, North Korea is there, and people might question, does that mean that we think that a nuclear conflict on the peninsula is likely or imminent? And this is a case where it's not so much the imminence or the likelihood, it's the consequences of that conflict which made it almost go without saying that we put it number 1, because I don't need to describe to this audience what the impact would be of a conflagration on the peninsula. People may talk about a bloody nose strike, which is what people are saying in the United States, a limited strike to which we know that North Korea would either not react or react in limited ways. Well, we don't know, and it's precisely because people assume that Kim Jong-un is unpredictable and undeterrable, that people are talking about a military strike. So how could you predict or deter the answer that somebody would have when your very reason for going to war is presumably that he's undeterrable and unpredictable? Why we think that there is a solution. So first, what's the problem? The problem is that you have a nuclear missile program on North Korea, which is moving, and it's been advancing now for some time. And on the US side, a red line, not an expression that I like particularly, but a red line, which is we will not allow, or President Trump's administration will not allow North Korea to acquire the capacity to strike the continental United States with a nuclear-tipped missile. And the race, and so far, sanctions have failed to stop them, and we know from experience that sanctions are not going to stop a program that is viewed as existential by the North Korean regime, or by other regimes for that matter. The threat of military action has not worked either. The President has said no more missile tests. They've taken missile tests, they've taken nuclear tests, so that hasn't worked either. So you could sanction them, people will suffer well before the leader will suffer, and his nuclear program will continue and outpace the strength with which the sanctions are supposed to squeeze the regime. So that's, if you just look at it that way, it is an equation that will lead you to war, because they will reach the point where they could reach where North Korea could reach the point where it could reach the continental United States before any of the measures the United States, short of military action, could stop it. The answer is, can you slow down what North Korea is doing, and you give time to diplomacy? And that's what we propose, and a crisis group proposes in a report that we just issued not too long ago after our list came out, which is, in exchange for North Korea halting certain of its most dangerous missile and nuclear aspects of its nuclear and missile program, the United States would halt and freeze some of its most provocative military exercises. Put time on the clock, give a chance of diplomacy. It's not going to meet President Trump's and his administration's expectation and desire of an immediate denuclearization of the peninsula. That's a desirable but unrealistic goal. Right now, what we need to do is slow things down to prevent a war that would be, again, it's hard to even find the words to describe what the consequences could be. And when we hear people speak cavalierly again about a bloody nose strike, it won't be a bloody nose for the people of South Korea, for the people of North Korea, or for their neighbors.
And indeed, it could become very quickly a regional war. Absolutely. That could involve both China and Russia, given the geography, given the history, and the way in which it began would be very significant. China's made it quite clear that the way in which it begins, if such a thing begins, would have a big influence on its own view of how it would react.
Right. I mean, I don't know that we could certainly not predict how China would react. China and Russia may simply stand back and let the United States pay the price for another confrontation, which, again, in this case, the major price would be paid by civilians on the ground. But I think what the Russians and the Chinese knew and learned again from their war in Iraq is let the U.S. get embroiled in another quagmire, let it bleed its resources, its men, its prestige, its credibility. So I don't know how they would react. But again, for us at Crisis Group, and I assume for people here, what matters is what the cost would be in just loss of life and absolute destruction.
And of course, it could even lead to the use of nuclear weapons, which is...
Nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, of which the North Korean regime has plenty.
So, well, we don't actually know, when you say plenty, we don't actually know that it has a nuclear capability. We know it has nuclear warheads, and we know it has missiles. Whether or not they can deliver that.
That's right. But chemical and they have weapons of mass destruction which they could use on South Korea, yes. And they have artillery shells which they could use on South Korea, where you have a million people that would be in the line of fire. So.
And what North Korea's always wanted as well is a peace treaty beyond the ceasefire with the United States. And could that form part of the package?
So again, what we would suggest is let's first put time on the clock and then negotiate. What does North Korea want? What kind of security guarantees does it want? Does it want a peace treaty? What kind of relationship does it want with the United States? It may not be possible to reach a deal. I mean, certainly we're not naive, but give it a try and avoid the alternative, which would be nightmarish in comparison.
You mentioned Afghanistan. We're seeing now, a pickup again in violence, absolutely terrible explosions in Kabul, loss of life, instability again, a big change in the politics again. How do you see that? Do you see that ever being resolved? I mean, how?
Ever.
How? I mean, I know ever's a long word, but in the foreseeable future, given everything that's happened, how can the international community move forward in this?
Well, again, what we say and what our analysts in Afghanistan have been saying for some time is the way you're not going to resolve it is by thinking that you just need a little bit more military pressure. I mean, let's not forget there were 100,000 U.S. Troops in Afghanistan at the, after 9/11. That wasn't enough to crush the Taliban insurgency. Now we're talking about, even if we get to, give a number, 15,000, 20,000, that's much less at a time when the Taliban are much stronger, where they control vast areas of the country. And at this time, for the United States to say we don't want to talk to the Taliban, we're simply going to squeeze them more, that falls to the fallacy. One of my former colleagues was telling me the other day, this is a fallacy that we see in so many of the situations where the United States, I'm just going to pick on them, but I think it's true of other foreign powers involved in military enterprises as well, like Saudi Arabia and Yemen. They tend to underestimate the leverage they have now, and they tend to overestimate the leverage they're going to have with more military power. By which I mean, they think, like today, the United States does have some leverage over the Taliban. Negotiate with them. They're not going to be able to get them to surrender, but they have some leverage. They have some things that the Taliban would want to see from the U.S. But the U.S. convinces itself we don't have enough to get them to surrender. So with a little 5,000 more troops, we're going to get them to really understand that, and they're going to get the message. Underestimation of current leverage, overestimation of future leverage. That's the story of creeping escalation in conflict after conflict after conflict. You're not going to get to squeeze these entities. I mean, the Saudi Arabia can't force the Houthis to surrender any more than Israel could force the Palestinians, or that Syrians could force the opposition. And this notion that by increasing the pressure, you're going to get them to simply agree to terms of surrender, that's an illusion that guarantees that wars and conflicts go on. Our cry is one for greater pragmatism and realism, which doesn't mean that the U.S. has to give in to the Taliban, or that Saudi Arabia has to give in to the Houthis, or again, any other of those conflicts that one might imagine. But it means that you need to find compromise, middle ground, and not live under this illusion that with just a little more power, as the U.S. felt in Vietnam, or as it felt in Iraq or in Afghanistan, that with just a little more power, you're going to get them exactly where you want.
So, I mean, this speaks very much to one of the trends that you've identified in this year's report, which you've dubbed militarization of foreign policy. And we're seeing this around the world, if you like, as sort of going back away from the other trend that or rather part and parcel of the other trend, where you've talked about the erosion of multilateralism. Those two things seem to go hand in hand. We're doing a lot of work at the moment, obviously, with the anniversaries of the centenary anniversaries of the end of the First World War, and what led to that, how we can learn from that, and one of the things then, of course, is that we didn't have an international system with multilateral organizations in the way that we have now that can deal with it. We have seen progress on North Korea in the Security Council, and in the past we've seen progress on Syria, for example, and so on. It's much harder now on Syria. But how do you see these competing trends? Or rather, I was going to say, because the other trend you've talked about is US retrenchment. But in fact, if Afghanistan's going to require more than increased troops, and we've got a potential war in North Korea, is that retrenchment from the United States? So how do you see all of this working, and how do we get out of it? Solve our problems for us, Rob.
No, I mean, there's a lot that you said I'll try to unpack, but there's this notion of U.S. retrenchment, which I always think, if I was living in the Middle East and there were 30,000 troops, or in Europe, tens of thousands of troops, or Northeast Asia, or around the world, the notion of U.S. retrenchment might sound very different. So I think we have to be very circumspect about the use of that term. The U.S. is still intervening with drone strikes and other forms of warfare around the world. The number of U.S. Of troop presence in Syria and Iraq has increased since President Trump took over. So yes, he ran on a platform of being a semi-isolationist, but I'd say he's a isolationist who's also quite militaristic. So we have the militaristic isolationist, which is a bit of a contradiction, but it's part of who he is, which is, on the one hand, he ran on the notion that the U.S. shouldn't expend resources overseas. It's all about America first. But on the other hand, he also likes to project power, likes to distinguish himself from his predecessor, President Obama, who he felt was too weak in the world. And so we're seeing these competing trends, which is why I'm not a big fan of talking about a retrenchment. I do think there's a retrenchment from diplomacy. And we're not seeing the US being that active in trying to mediate, whether it's in Libya or in Yemen or in Afghanistan or in North Korea. So we're seeing sort of this view that diplomacy is not for us.
Would you say Russia's doing the same thing? I mean, if you look at,
well, Russia's never been particularly engaged in diplomacy.
Well, if you look at the intervention in against Ukraine and then also within Syria, but we have seen Russia, for example, negotiate with Lavrov and Kerry. We've seen with the Iran nuclear deal. We've seen Russia engage in diplomacy there. So, but we've also seen this sort of militarized foreign policy as well from Russia.
Sure, I mean, I'm also, I think there's a trend. The trend, and we say this in the piece that I write, the trend is, I think it's too easy to say it's all about Trump. I mean, you know, militarization has been going on for some time. Certainly you mentioned Russia, and we could talk about Ukraine, we could talk about Syria, we could talk about the US and Iraq and Afghanistan. Those are military enterprises. So I think we tend to idealize and to mythologize the past. And, you know, the 90s were the years where everything was great. It was great maybe if you were living in the United States. It probably wasn't great if you were on the other side, the receiving end of US foreign policy, or if you were in Rwanda, or if you were in the Balkans. So I think we have to be a bit careful. I think it is true that there's right now a much more inward-looking perspective with countries in Europe, dealing with populism, dealing with nativism, dealing with the fear of immigrants, dealing with the fear of the other, and all that contributes to less attention, less resources, less interest in, this crowd notwithstanding, less interest in foreign affairs. And so I think you're seeing leaders that are much more, as I say, looking inwards rather than trying to think of how they could energize diplomacy. There's some exceptions, but I think that is a trend. That is an accurate trend. I just think we have to be careful about overgeneralizing about, you know, now there was a golden era of multilateralism and the year of multilateral institutions where there was an altruistic foreign policy trying to resolve conflict and responsibility to protect. That was as much myth as reality. So it was never as good as it was. It has gotten worse, no doubt about it. And it's gotten worse because of some of these phenomena, countries that are much more interested in simply expanding their power. And you know, we could talk about conflicts between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Qatar and how that's infecting the Middle East and infecting the Horn of Africa and infecting up to Egypt. I mean, you're seeing how regional powers are now taking advantage of the fact that we have seen the end of the era of unipolarity, where, you know, the U.S. was dominant, that hegemonic era that probably lasted only about a decade between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the Iraq War. That's the parenthesis during which, of the bracket era, where the U.S. was perceived and was largely dominant. I think since then we've seen sort of different countries expressing themselves and trying to promoting their own interests. In some cases that's better than a unipolar world. In other cases it's not. And I think, as I just said, where we see regional powers competing for influence, and we see, and I mentioned, you know, in that sort of micro-geographic system of the Gulf and the Horn of Africa, where and the Middle East, where conflicts can very quickly bleed from one theater to another. Mm. And there you don't have diplomacy, you don't have an attempt to try to bring countries together. One of the themes that we, at Crisis Group, we're developing in a separate strand of work is talking to Europeans and saying, you've long complained about U.S. hegemony, control over foreign affairs, whether it's you know, their monopoly over the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, or over a whole host of issues. Well, now's your time. If you really believe that there was an over-reliance on the U.S. or dominance by the U.S., now's the time. You have a president of the United States who is unpredictable, unreliable, and that much of the world wants to have little to do with. You have a dearth of diplomacy. You have an explosion of conflict. So now's the time, if Europe really wants to show that it can do things despite or without the United States, to step up, save the Iran deal, perhaps engage in diplomacy between Iran and Saudi Arabia rather than take sides and exacerbate that conflict. Try to show that it can do what it claimed couldn't do when the US was dominating the field.
So European powers have stepped up over the Iran deal, and they've held just before the latest decision point for President Trump. They held a big press conference, the leaders, foreign ministers. Obviously, we also have Russia and China in that deal, and the response from Iran. But what could happen should the United States completely undermine and even withdraw from that agreement? What could happen? How could those countries, if you like, hold the line and see it through?
So this, I mean, Crisis Group just came out with a report again on this. I'm going to answer that to all your questions. Go look at our latest report. But and the question that we addressed was not whether or not the U.S. will withdraw from the deal, although we're trying to predict that. It's very hard with President Trump because I think there are different voices in his head, but the predominant voice is to, as I said, distinguish himself from President Obama, which would mean walk away. But we're saying, assume it happens. I think most European countries would say it's a grievous mistake. I mean, this is a deal that is living up to its expectation, maybe even exceeding expectation in terms of Iranian compliance. And that's not just me, and I helped negotiate the deal, so I'm biased, perhaps. But it's the view of the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency. It's the view which monitors Iranian compliance. It's the view of every country that negotiated the deal, including those like France that took a pretty harsh position. It's true of the U.S. administration itself, which is the one that is talking about walking away. So there's no doubt that it's working. But if the United States does walk away, our view, and we give some ideas in our report, is Europe should try to convince the Iranians to stick to it, rather than get into this tit for tat. You violate the deal, we'll violate the deal, which would lead Iran to be isolated, because Europe is not going to sit on the sidelines if Iran resumes its nuclear program against going beyond the constraints that the nuclear deal has imposed. They will have to side with the U.S., even if the U.S. is responsible for the collapse of the deal. So our message to the Iranians, to the Europeans, is see if you can at least preserve that part of the deal that can be immunized, protected from U.S. secondary sanctions. See how much you can do. And then our message to the Iranians is you'd be better off showing that you're standing with Europe against the United States than standing alone against the two of them. It's a hard message because Iran has its own politics, and we meet with Iranians, and our analysts meet with them all the time, and they say, well, we have our politics. If the U.S. is going to violate the deal, then we have to respond in kind. That's understandable. It's unwise, and because it wouldn't serve Iran's interests, as we said at all. So they continue their nuclear program, but then they're going to be back in the age of sanctions. So there is a way. It's a very narrow line, and we speak to Europeans a lot about this. Are there ways to protect the deal, blocking legislation that would prohibit European companies from abiding by U.S. secondary sanctions, finding ways to have the dealing that doesn't touch the dollar, trade that doesn't implicate the dollar, but other currencies. There are ways of doing it. It's very hard, and Iran will suffer if the U.S. reimposes sanctions, but will suffer less than if it also confronts European sanctions.
So before I go out to the audience and get everybody's participation, just one quick question. Which conflict would you have liked to have seen in the top 10 that didn't make it in? Which one do you think?
Oh, liked. I wish none of them were in the top 10. I wish we.
But when you were doing the fight and so on, which one did you lose the fight on?
I mean, I wrote it in my introductory piece. There's one conflict which very close to my heart for reasons of my professional background and my personal background, which didn't make it partly because at the time that we selected it, it didn't seem like it would have been in the top 10, and probably still is not, and that's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a perennial conflict, I mean, perennial in terms of it's always there, it's always sort of on the verge of boiling, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, but there is a sort of, it has remained relatively stable. That's pretty much of a misnomer, but compared to other conflicts. But of late, you've had things like President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and all of which is eroding on the Palestinian side faith in the United States, of course, faith in diplomacy, faith in nonviolence, faith in the two-state solution. And meanwhile, you have the cauldron that is Gaza, which is boiling because of the absolutely unspeakable humanitarian conditions there. You put those two together, you see the delegitimization of the Palestinian Authority, which is inevitable because what President Abbas stands for is for everything that I just said is being eroded. Diplomacy with the United States, the two-state solution, the peace process, nonviolence, and Palestinians are going to question that if we continue to see this slow but steady erosion of those pillars. Now, there still is obviously possibility that things change, but the reason that I wrote in the introduction that we might have added it had we known about the Jerusalem decision is, at some point, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is nonviolent or relatively nonviolent until it isn't anymore. And we've almost always been surprised by the explosion, whether it's the first intifada, the second intifada, war in Gaza. But these things happen with a sort of a dangerous regularity. Something will happen, something will explode, particularly at a time when Palestinians feel hopeless. So that's one conflict. I'm not saying I wish that it had been on the top 10, but that it could have made it, as it could make it every single year.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go out now to people in the room, and what I'd like you to do is put up your hand, and if I call on you, and I'm always looking at the back, particularly at younger people, when I call on you, if you could say what your name is and if you're from an institution, that would really help. I'm looking at the back here, please. Thank you. The reason at the back is because when I was a kid, all the cool kids sat at the back. And
Alex Farrow, Chatham House member. My question is about the Ukrainian conflict and the recent comments that have been made by General Sir Richard Sheriff about describing Crimea as the Sudetenland moment of Western Europe. I'm asking is the Ukraine, do you treat it as if it's a contained conflict that's solely to the Ukrainian people and a conflict between Ukraine and Russia? Or is it indicative of a greater Russian process of Slavorussia and perhaps indicators of them having conflict or interest in the Baltic with the ethnic Russian population there?
Thank you. I'll go to the front here, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm John Preston of the Chatham House Europe programme, and I want to spoil the simplicity of your 10 by making it 11, and that is the Kurdish population and the disruptive effect they're having on Syria, Turkey, and Iran, and whether you could count that as a conflict area. Thank you.
Thank you. And then at the back again, please. There's two hands I see there. But perhaps in the blue shirt, and then I'll come to you later. That's okay. The light blue shirt. Thank you.
Hi, Utsa Rai, Chatham House member. My question is on Pakistan, which hasn't made your list. But I think with sort of increased pressure from the holding back of US aid and the fact that it being a nuclear state, what chance do you see of sort of an internal meltdown in terms of government capability in the northwest frontier and in Balochistan?
So before you answer those, I'm just going to say to everyone in the room, there were 3 men who spoke just now. So my challenge now is for 3 women, please, in the next round. Thank you. Please put up your hands when I come to you. Okay.
That's one thing in which you don't distinguish yourself from the US yet. I'm not seeing as much diversity. Great questions. Let me try to answer them pretty quickly. So Ukraine does make our list. In some ways, the danger there is of a frozen conflict. By frozen, I mean the status quo becomes entrenched, and Russian dominance, certainly of Crimea, but also of the Donbass, is that's and their proposal for having peacekeepers does seem to be aimed at freezing rather than resolving the conflict, and getting people to accept the fait accompli, that this is going to be how it's going to be, and the questioning of the boundaries of Ukraine being accepted. Does that? So I mean, that's a danger in and of itself on a continent that had established a norm against the transgression of sovereign borders. Is it part of a larger pattern? I mean, I think there's no doubt that Russia's been flexing its muscles, and then no doubt, and partly coming out of a period during the post-Cold War where they felt that they had been humiliated and treated as a second-class country. How far that goes, and is this a trend where they're going to try, bit by bit, as you say, the analogy that you mentioned? I don't know that I want to make that kind of prediction. I think, obviously, Russia has ambitions now that it feels because it feels that it had been on the receiving end of mistreatment past the Cold War. And I think it's important for Europe to set some lines about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, to prevent, lessons being learned about how you can get away with challenging boundaries and challenging sovereignty, which we have seen Russia do. So I do think that's important. I think we're looking at, are there creative ideas to unlock the situation in Ukraine? It's hard to see. What our recommendation has been to the Europeans and to the US is to try to jujitsu a bit the idea that the Russians have put on the table of peacekeeping force, but turn it around so that it's not used to freeze the conflict, but to unlock the conflict so that these peacekeepers would be there to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. Obviously, that's easier said than done, but to at least try to work and see whether, under the pressure of sanctions and with this out, whether President Putin will take that exit. It's not our prediction that he will, but our view is you keep trying, you put things on the table, you stick to the principle, which is the sovereignty of Ukraine, but you also try to see whether you can prod, and if there's some pressure, economic pressure, deriving from the sanctions that would get President Putin to move. Kurdish question, that's a great question. We do mention Syria and the risk of a confrontation between the Kurds, Turkey, or as the United States and the Kurds are allied in the east so far of Syria, does that become a pressure point and a conflict with Iran and Iranian-backed forces? But we could have also spoken about PKK struggle in Turkey or the campaign and the conflict between Turkey and the PKK. We could have spoken about Iraq. We could have spoken about Iran. The Kurdish question, they seem to be at their apogee as a result of the large degree of autonomy that they had gained in Iraq, and the fact that in Syria, they certainly had made huge advances, huge strides as a result of the fact that they presented themselves, and they were in fact the most effective ground force against ISIS in Syria. That pendulum has swung for two reasons. Number one, over, how could I put it, excessive appetite on the part of the KRG, the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, and the backlash to the referendum, which has really set back the Kurdish cause. And in Syria, the defeat of ISIS led very predictably to the fact that the Kurds are slightly less important. And the real question is going to be, how do the Kurds manage to find a place between their relationship with the US, which is going to erode over time because they're less useful to the US, and their relationship with Turkey, which is going to become more and more conflictual over time, because Turkey is going to not only view them as the enemy, but understand that the U.S. umbrella is not going to be as protective in the future. Again, our recommendation there, but this is just as difficult as the one in Ukraine, but that seems to be crisis group's job, which is to make difficult recommendations to people who don't really want to hear them, which is the key to this is the Turkish Pkk conflict. And if there's progress made there, as was being made until 2015, there has been some advance between Erdogan and Öcalan so between Turkey and the PKK. That came to a screeching halt for reasons that we could get into. But as long as that conflict continues, Turkey will not abide a Kurdish role or autonomy in Syria. And if that happens, then the risk of finding an alliance between Turkey, Iran, the Syrian regime, aligned against Kurdish ambitions for autonomy, that's something, if I were Kurd, I'd be very worried about. So there needs to be more emphasis or more attention given to the need for some kind of de-escalation between the PKK and Turkey. Easier said than done, but without that, this fundamental contradiction that the US, and I was party to it, so this is not a criticism of the Trump administration, it originated with the Obama administration, which is contradiction between using as your main ally in the fight against ISIS in Syria, the most inveterate foe of a NATO ally in the north. And how do you put that puzzle together is virtually impossible, which is why what we're seeing today in Afrin, what we may see tomorrow in the eastern side of Syria, will take place unless somehow you can unlock this conflict between the PKK and Turkey. Question on Pakistan, very quickly. The pressure on Pakistan, the U.S. pressure on Pakistan is designed to get Pakistan to act differently towards the Taliban and towards Afghanistan. Again, our analysts diagnosis is it's not going to work. I mean, Pakistan is not doing this because there's no pressure from the U.S. They're doing it, again, we could debate the rationale, the justification. They feel that it's their national interest because of their conflict with India, because of their own security calculations, that it's better for them to take the position and to adopt the policies they've adopted. So, you know, pressure from the U.S. may work, but only if it's coupled with some kind of diplomatic initiative to resolve the conflict in Afghanistan and perhaps to help de-escalate tensions between India and Pakistan. Do we see the risk of a real implosion of Pakistan? I can't say that that hasn't made the top of the list. So I don't think we see that as being in the cards. It's a country that one always has to watch because of the combination of their nuclear capacity, because of the domestic issues that and instability. But I think our assessment is that's not a place where we expect, and these are famous last words that may come to haunt me, where we expect sort of an implosion. This is any time in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Please, woman just there. Remember, I want 2 more women to put their hands up for this.
Thanks. Elizabeth Ames from Save the Children. If everyone has a pet conflict, mine is Libya. We've seen a dramatic de-escalation number of people coming across from Libya, partly because of sustained action by the Italians and by the Europeans, convincing the Libyans to stop people getting on boats. We know that the humanitarian situation inside Libya is really bad. We know that most foreign actors can't get in there. Save the Children has had a lot of problems accessing Libya, working with the government, trying to get aid in there. Do you see, I think in some respects it's a forgotten conflict. It's one that threatens Europe quite directly. You see, you know, you look at the map behind you and Libya is directly below the majority of southern Europe. Do you see any prospects for that conflict being resolved or for people becoming interested enough in it again to try and resolve it?
Thank you. Here, please, and then there.
Thanks. Not only am I a woman, but I'm from the LSE Center for Women, Peace and Security, and my question is about gender, so 3 hat for you there. So I know Crisis Group does do work on gender, peace, and security, but reading through the conflicts to watch, there wasn't a huge discussion around gender, and despite the fact that, you know, gender is playing a big role in many, I would argue, most of these conflicts, in your perspective, what are the emerging trends, not so much in gender and conflict, but more in the policy spaces? Because we know we've seen this push in gender mainstreaming and you know, having gendered perspectives on policy solutions to conflicts. So I'm interested in your perspective of where you see the emerging trends in gender from more of a policy space. Thanks.
And then here on the end there, and then I'll come to you the next round. Great. Keep putting up those hands. Brilliant.
Amongst world leaders and foreign policy advisors, where are you seeing signs of people taking a creative approach to solving problems?
That's a tough question. I don't know that I want to name names.
But they're good names.
Good names, I know. But when you name a name, you're obviously ignoring another. So, I mean, listen, this is not a time. I think I'm not saying something too controversial. This is not a time that has been in which we've witnessed great leadership on the world stage. I think leadership, as I would define it, which is leadership that is trying to resolve problems, work in a multilateral setting to address the global challenges that we face, from climate change to hunger to conflict. That's not what we're seeing. I think President Macron has shown a leadership ambition, and in some cases, a leadership results which are at least worthy of attention. He's certainly, and he's trying to do it in a way which is interesting vis-a-vis the United States. He's certainly not reflexively anti-Trump. He's trying to work with Trump, but maintaining a pretty independent stance. We've seen that on climate. We're seeing it on the Iran deal. We saw it on the issue surrounding the Lebanese prime minister, who was sort of a guest of the Saudis. So I think there's something there, but you know, we're seeing the African Union seems to, in some cases, trying to be a little more proactive, as they see the rest of the world not caring about them, other than through 2 lenses, as I said earlier, terrorism or migration. I think so. You may be seeing something there, but as I say, this is not a moment where we're spoiled for choice when it comes to looking at world leaders who have distinguished themselves by their foresight and by their leadership skills in terms of ending conflict, which is what, you know, our organization is particularly focused on. Jumping to Libya, first of all, we have to be optimistic because the UN envoy is a former chairman of the board of crisis groups. So by definition, we're going to be Hassan Salame. So by definition, we're going to be more optimistic than we were a year ago. It is slightly a forgotten conflict, but it's a forgotten conflict precisely for the reason I was just giving. If migrants don't come to European shore, then people think it's kind of resolved, forgetting two things. Number one, the price paid for the reduction, partly, and we've written about it and others have documented it. You know, if you deal with militias and you sort of get them to make sure that migrants don't come, then you have to look about how they're being dealt with in Libya, and that is now a story that is not one we should be very proud of. And so much of what's happening in Libya has not been resolved. Proliferation of weapons, militias, the existence of several governments, the contestation of the constitutional order, the inability to reunify the Libyans over sort of a national narrative. Again, I'm going to be more optimistic because I think there is attention given by the United Nations, and from what I'm hearing, some of the divisions of the past, which are still existing, but it seemed to be lessened between what the UAE and Egypt are doing on the one hand, Qatar and Turkey on the other. That seems to have somewhat abated, in part because Qatar is preoccupied by other problems. Its rivalry and the sanctions imposed against it by Saudi Arabia. But also, I think a number of countries are prepared to give Hassan Salame a chance. So there may be a window. Again, I'm not going to be overly optimistic, but there is a window to try to bring some degree of unity to a country in which, as Salame himself has said, where they are using their own funds to destroy themselves. I mean, it's a very wealthy country, and they seem to be pilfering state wealth in order to kill themselves, or each other, which is not exactly a wise course. But it is a country that we've been following closely. And again, our message to the Europeans and to others is, don't ignore it because the problem that you care about most seems to have gone away. It hasn't gone away for good, and in any event, it's just a symptom of a deeper problem. Gender, so it's something that we are focused on increasingly at Crisis Group. I think you're right to point out that it is now, it really has become a mainstream issue, and we're trying to make it mainstream in our work, but some governments have defined their foreign policy as a feminist foreign policy. And if you look at Canada, if you look at Sweden, if you look at others, that's obviously something that they are pushing, and they're pushing hard, which is good for, it's good for everyone, but it's good for NGOs because they're forcing NGOs to think in ways that I have to admit doesn't always come naturally to our analysts who are great analysts, but now we're telling them when you interview people, make sure that you take that perspective in mind, and it doesn't mean checking a box and saying women need to be in the peace process, women need to be at the table. That, you could say that, but it's really understanding the perspective, understanding the dynamic, understanding not just how they could be victims of conflict, but actors in conflict. And so we've done work, and some of the work that I think we've done best on the question of gender is when our reporting is focused on that question, women in Boko Haram, which we did. We had a report which didn't focus on gender, but was very much looking at the dynamics in Myanmar and what role women played in Buddhist nationalism, which when it went against conventional wisdom. And if you understand that, it makes it easier, not necessarily to resolve, but to understand the dynamics of the conflict, and then to have much more realistic solutions. So yes, more women at the peace table, but it's not just that. It's understanding what role they play in conflict as victims, as actors, and that's something that we need to do better, and that we were doing anyway, but I think under the leadership of the countries that I mentioned, we will be doing even more.
Perhaps as well, afterwards, you might want to talk about gender being at the causes of conflict as well.
Indeed.
So so I've got one at the front here, and then two people at the back, two people I'd called on before. So if we can go to the front first. Thank you.
I'm Sam Nassif. I'm a journalist, freelancer. I want to ask you whether you agree with John Kerry's advice to President Abbas over the Palestine issue, whether you agree that he should play it down at the moment and not attack Trump to a great degree, but rather sort of concentrate on the positive role that America can play. We heard something in Ma'arif and some of the Arab press that he met an advisor to Abbas, and who was one of your colleagues, and that he told him that Trump will not last for more than 1 year, you know, and that they should be careful not to criticize the United States. Now, do you agree that this kind of attitude can reduce conflict? What we are seeing in the last few days is assassinations on, you know, in the Palestinian territory. So do you think it's a good idea what Kerry is advising?
Thank you. At the back, there were two people, one in green, yes, you, and then in the green jumper afterwards. Thanks.
Hi. So I hold this country dear to my heart as I am from there. So my question is about Venezuela and whether or not it is a threat to the region, geopolitically speaking, because we already see it as quite a threat to Colombia because there's been a huge exodus of Venezuelans going to Colombia and affecting it on the socioeconomic aspect. So I was just wondering, and then on the other hand, is this an issue that needs to be resolved internally, or is this something that needs to be resolved with some kind of help from internationally? So, thank you.
Hi. My name is Tom Fenn. I'm a journalist with Reuters. I had a question about Yemen. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on the prospect for any kind of peace in Yemen. It's been nearly 4 years of civil war there that's obviously caused immense suffering for Yemenis, and the war seems to be very much dictated by a growing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so if the US can't or won't put pressure on its ally Saudi Arabia, what sort of prospect do you see for any de-escalation of tensions there?
Okay, again, three great questions. I'll start with first with President Abbas. My colleague Hussein Aga his name was invoked. Both he and Secretary Kerry have denied that the report that went out was accurate. So, anyway, I'm not going to comment on what Kerry might have advised or not advised. I'm going to tell you what Crisis Group believes. I mean, we've said for some time, and we had a report years ago saying, the title was "The Emperor Has No Clothes," which is telling the Palestinians and telling the Israelis, frankly, the peace process as we know it is most unlikely to yield what it was supposed to yield, as I said earlier, a two-state solution. And so there's have to be a rethink of the way forward. From a Palestinian perspective today, I would say, I don't know what President Trump is going to do. You know, we could all sit here and predict what he's going to do. We've seen his track record so far has not been particularly friendly to the Palestinians. But if I think that just as we tell the Europeans when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, think about how you would act despite and without the United States. I would say to the Palestinians also to think despite and without the United States. If it happens that President Trump, challenges all our expectations, does something that works, fine. But the anticipation, the expectation should be that he won't. And so then I think for the Palestinians, and it's not to me to give them advice, but Crisis Group is in the business of making recommendations, get their domestic house in order, which is, again, easier said than done, but national unity, agreeing on a way forward. What is their goal vis-a-vis Israel and relations with Israel? What means do they consider to be legitimate? Can they be in agreement among Palestinians so that you don't have the West Bank, Gaza, Fatah, Hamas, and others, that you have a unified Palestinian position? When I was younger, I was a student of national liberation movements. In my graduate days, actually, here in the UK. And one lesson that I took from this is national liberation movements never work if they're divided. I don't know that there's a case of a national liberation movement that has succeeded when it was internally at war with itself. Now, there's some cases where they're at war with itself, and one faction destroys the other. That's what happened in Algeria. I'm not recommending that to the Palestinians. They went through their own mini civil war in 2006 or 7. Not recommending they do that again. In other cases, they try to find some form of consensus on means, ends, objectives, and that's where I think the Palestinians, what they need to do, because they're not going to be in a position to advance their goals if they're divided, if they're fragmented, if they don't have some minimal consensus on what they're trying to achieve or how they're going to try to achieve it. So I'll forget about what Kerry did or didn't say, and again, he's denied saying what was reported. Our advice has been consistent at Crisis Group for a long time. Palestinians should focus on what they need to do to strengthen their position, to be able to negotiate from a position of greater strength. Venezuela, we do put it in our list. I think it's number 10, but that doesn't mean that it's the least important. And yes, we agree that it's number one, it's a situation that is of great urgency. It concerns the Venezuelan people themselves and the economic consequences, the consequences in terms of violence, consequences in terms of democratic institutions, but that seems to have eroded quite significantly already. But also the consequences for the neighbors. And you mentioned refugees, instability, borders that become increasingly porous. So, yes, something needs to be done. In general, I would say Crisis Group's philosophy, if there is one, is that conflicts in which there's nobody who's going to be more interested in the conflict than the protagonists. And so obviously they're the ones, because they have an existential stake in the outcome of the conflict, they're the ones who have to be convinced. But very often it's not going to be done without outside help, without outside pressure, without outside incentives. And here our view is that what needs to happen is to get as much as possible greater consensus, because President Maduro can play it, the Chinese and the Russians against the others, some of the local actors or regional actors against those who are taking a harder line. If there could be a greater degree of consensus so that pressure could be put on him in terms of how he's going to treat the opposition, how he's going to run the country in terms of elections, what are the conditions for elections, because right now he's leading for elections that most of the world are not going to recognize as legitimate. So that will make certainly no positive difference. Can there be certain criteria that would be laid out by the Europeans in conjunction with the region, and making sure that Russia and China don't give him a way out? That's the challenge. It's a hard one because some countries don't view the conflict in the same way. But that's a theme that we see in other countries, whether it's DRC, the Congo, where if there's not unity among external actors, then the local actors will always try to find a way to play one against the other. The role of local actors bring me to Tom's question and the issue of Yemen. Yemen is a place that is, again, I personally had involvement because I worked for President Obama. This is not one of my most glorious episodes, because obviously not only did we not prevent the war, but we were not able to resolve it, and have been criticized for our continued support for Saudi Arabia, which again we could debate and discuss why that was done. Do I think there's a way out? Yes, and I'd be more even, in some ways I think Yemen well, I think we have to distinguish between two wars in Yemen. There's one war, which is the war that is causing today 8 million people on the brink of famine, 3 million displaced, 1 million affected by cholera. That war, which is the war, if we want to be simplistic, between the Houthi alliance, today really the Houthi, against the Saudi-led coalition, that one I think there is a way out, because it is not. What is it that Saudi Arabia is most concerned about? What it says it's most concerned about, and I believe they're most concerned about, it's Iran's influence in Yemen. That influence has been a self-fulfilling prophecy to a large extent. For those of you who know Yemen, the Houthis don't have a long-term relationship with Iran. That relationship only grew more intense and deeper as a result of the war. Obviously, the Houthis would turn to the one country that was prepared to support them in the middle of the war, which was Iran, and Iran was only too happy to oblige. If that's the main concern of Saudi Arabia, then there must be a deal out there in which the Houthis agree to not cut, but to alter significantly the nature of their ties to Iran. No more Iranian weapons, no more missiles that could reach Saudi Arabia. But in exchange, they're going to want to have their own assurances, which means a share of power disproportionate to their actual weight. That's a deal that one could see, and when I speak to Saudis, they're not opposed to it. They just don't trust that the Houthis are going to abide by it. And they also are not under sufficient pressure. And you mentioned the United States. Let's give credit to President Trump on this thing. He has restored better relationship with Saudi Arabia. Fine. Use it. Use it to tell the Saudis, okay, we now have better relations with you. We want to see you deliver in Yemen. And, we're seeing more and more from this administration in the U.S. greater concern about the humanitarian situation in Yemen, far more than we saw 6 months ago. President Trump tweeted about it, which is the highest expression of policy in the United States. So by definition, he cares. The State Department has been much tougher against Saudi Arabia, and so I think there is greater leverage that this administration has, frankly, than the Obama administration ever had on Saudi Arabia. Use it. use it and say, we will back your security, but in exchange, you need to stop this war. You need to stop this campaign, which is causing what I said earlier. Now, we have an excellent analyst who works on Yemen, and what she would say is that conflict is resolvable. You'd need a new Security Council resolution because the one that is currently in force is slanted towards President Hadi in a way that is simply completely divorced from the realities on the ground today. But even if you did resolve that in the way that I just described to meet Saudi security needs, but also Houthi security and political needs, you'll be left with the other war, which is the war that we're seeing emerge with greater force these days, which is the civil war within Yemen between North, South, within, and I know you know Yemen well, Southerners themselves at each other's throats, Emirati allies against Saudi allies. That war, unfortunately, because of the fragmentation of the country, because of the lack of central order, because of the proliferation of weapons, that war is likely to continue. But, and this is maybe a thin reed on which to rest our hopes, but it is still a war that would cause less devastation than the war that's taking place now with the virtual blockade of certain areas of Yemen, the inability to bring in food and medicine, the air campaign, the closure of airports. That's what needs to come to an end today. Both sides, the Houthis and Saudis, have to stop targeting civilians. Were that to happen, I think then we'd have to focus on that other war, which would get probably more intense because people would be fighting for the spoils, but still more manageable than the war we're dealing with today.
Rob, we have a hard stop in 2 minutes.
Okay.
So before I let you go, can we just go to sub-Saharan Africa for a minute? So you've talked about the Sahel, you've talked about DRC. Can I also bring to your attention our concerns about Cameroon and what's going on in that region? And if you could just say a few words about the significance of each of those.
It's a great conflict to end, and we hadn't planned it this way because it is really one that I think showcases what Crisis Group does, which many others don't or can't do. Because we have a presence in Cameroon, we've been saying for some time, be careful. There's several conflicts going on, which we detail in not in this report, the kind of conflicts to watch, but we have another list of conflicts, which is the EU watch list, which came out last week, and Cameroon figures in there. There's a conflict against Boko Haram in the far north, but in the north and southwest, there's a conflict between Anglophones and Francophones, and that's a conflict that our analysts have been saying for some time. Be careful, this one is going to explode, and we're now seeing Anglophones resorting more to armed insurgency because the response from the central government has been so lacking. And we're very worried about that. Elections are coming up this year. In fact, there's I think something like 18 elections coming up in Africa, and many of them are reason for concern. This is one, because if it takes place in the midst of the general problems of the state, but amidst a real conflict between Anglophones and Francophones, that's just going to make the situation worse. So we have been coming up with recommendations now for some time about how government, how President Biya needs to be more receptive to the legitimate grievances of the Anglophone community, which is something, again, a conflict that I didn't know much about before I started reading anything about before reading Crisis Group reports. But that's where we think, not all of our conflicts are the ones that make the headlines. Yeah. But all of them affect human beings, and all of them, and some of them, which are the ones like Cameroon, where you don't have regional actors and superpowers involved. This is one that is very local, where African nations can make a difference, where France and the UK can make a difference, but it's very local. It doesn't have to spread, but it's where we can make a difference, and where we hope that Crisis Group, by ringing alarm bells, saying here's some practical steps that can be taken to at least mitigate the worst effects of violence, we think we can be effective. And so thank you for raising that as the last one.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for your comprehensive knowledge. There's so much more, unfortunately. As you're right, what we'd love to have is the 10 top crises that we prevented next year, right? That's what we need. That's
our goal.
That's our goal.
Thanks for the challenge.
So thank you all very much. Thank you for your participation, your great questions. I'm really sorry for those of you who wanted questions and couldn't get them. Thanks, Rob. Thanks to Crisis Group for bringing to our attention these difficult situations and helping focus them on. I think that's an impact already, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.